Hello and welcome to day 68 of the 1000 days of no code challenge. In yesterday's video, we saw how do we allow other applications to communicate with our application. Whether it is for them to send the data or to receive the data, we enabled it by making the backend workflow as a public API. But it was without the authentication, which means anybody who has access to the API URL can make this call without having to know what are the authentication methods. And that, in most of the cases, is not good, unless and until you know that this should be exposed for anyone to use. For example, in the jokes API that we saw, it was not having any authentication, which means anybody could call it and they could get the response. For something like that, running it without the authentication is a good practice. But if you want only authorized people to access the data, then authorization is a must. And in today's video, we will see how do we run the backend workflow via public API, but with authentication. So let's get started. Okay, so today, let's see how do we add authentication so that unauthorized users are not able to make these calls. Okay, before that, one of the things that we missed yesterday is if we go to the backend workflow and if we don't expose this particular workflow as public API and then you make a call from here, okay, the API connector, it will throw an error saying not found, right? Workflow not found, create user, which means create user workflow is not found. Even though we are making this from the API connector of the same app, only if we expose it as public API will we be able to make a call, right? So I'll click on got it, go back, select the workflow, expose this as public API workflow, and then make a call again, and this will work, right? Each time we are making a call, okay, it's not creating a new user because in Bubble, email ID is unique, right? So it is just giving us the same unique ID of this particular user which was created before. Now, let's see how do we add the authentication to this backend workflows. And for that, we have to go to settings, and in the API section, we have generate a new API token. Okay, you can give the name to this, right? It can be backing. Okay, this naming is just for us to understand where are we using this. I'll click on this, which will copy the private key. Let's go back to the backend workflow, click on create user flow and uncheck this checkbox, which is this workflow can be run without authentication. When you uncheck this, that would say Bubble that this particular workflow can be run only with authentication. Now let's see how do we use authentication. Let's go to plugin. There is the workflow here, create user, and we need to add a header, and the key will be authorization. The value would be bearer space the key that we have copied from the settings API section, right? So we copied this private key from here, and that would be pasted over here after bearer and space. Once we add the authorization, if we make an API call, we will get the response. Now let me remove this authorization from here and show you. It will throw us an error. And the error says you must authenticate to call this method. And error class is unauthorized, which means this call is now only allowed for authorized persons, those of them who have the authorization key, which is the private key, right? So let's bring the authorization back and make a call. You can see it runs smoothly. Ideally, all the backend workflows which are publicly exposed needs to be via authorization method only, unless and until you know for sure that this particular API can be used by anybody publicly, like the jokes API we saw during our API session. If you have multiple backend workflows which are to be accessed from here, you can also move this header from here to here. That way, you don't have to add the header section of authorization for every call that you are adding within this API. Okay, what I mean by that is if you add another call from here, that need not have the authorization because we have already added the shared header which has the authorization with the bearer key over here. Now, if you make the call, you will get the response. Let me quickly change the email ID here with mno@rate7.com with Ritesh to Vitika. Right? Let me reinitialize the call and you can see we will get the response, right? And the user is also created. And this is how you expose the backend workflow to the public and ensure that only authorized persons can call it with authorization key. We have just explored how to run public APIs with authentication. And this ensures that only authorized persons can make these API calls and no one else, thereby keeping your data secure and safe. And that's all for today. Keep building, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.